When Paul comes to Corinth after his adventures in Athens, he says to the Corinthians, I decided to preach nothing among you except Christ crucified, which is foolishness to the Greeks. And, I think that Paul learned a lesson there. And I think for myself, I get tempted sometimes, Scott, when I want to do apologetics, and I want to convert people or move people who aren't really believers or strong Christians. I want to use natural law. I want to use good, hard logic and natural law arguments to win people over to a moral case, to believe that abortion's bad, or to believe in different things. And that's a good thing, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I fear that Catholicism in America has taken a temptation over the last 40 years of trying to use natural reason and natural law as the main way to move and change the culture, right? And here's the point that Paul learned, and what we can learn too. If you take the approach of just using reason alone and not proclaiming the cross, you're going to be as effective as Paul was in Athens. And here's the radical claim. Paul proclaims what is foolish to the Greeks in Corinth, and yet many of them are struck by that, and they convert. And so there is a foolishness to the cross. It is foolish that God decided to reveal his love and his innermost self, not through a syllogism, not through a great revelation by a Greek philosopher, but by Jesus dying and bleeding on a cross. That is crazy. That is foolishness, that God is revealed by the Son's crucifixion, by Jesus' crucifixion on wood with nails.
That's right. And there's such a paradox there, and it's beautiful how in St. John's Gospel we have the Passion account, and Jesus goes in and out of the praetorium, and he's questioned, and finally the way that St. John sets up his Gospel, when Jesus is on the cross is presented as the throne. He reigns from the cross as the King of glory, the crucified King, the suffering King. And there's such a paradox right there in St. John's Gospel that captures this kind of foolishness that we're talking about. And I think in Acts too, there's a similar dynamic where St. Paul is brought before this person and that person, but in his clever ways, he's almost orchestrating the scene in a way. They want to start flogging him, and he says, aha, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do that. And I appeal to Caesar, so you've got to take me somewhere else to be judged. So he's suffering like the suffering Christ. He's somehow ruling a little bit in this clever way, but in the end, he's going to point out the paradox, like the suffering King on the cross. He's going to point out the paradox that I have this great learning, but it's received as a kind of foolishness.
Yeah, and I think the key is not to be afraid. As you mentioned before, Paul is bold. Not to be afraid. I think oftentimes we live in a secular culture that's not religious, and we're just afraid that people are going to take religion and religious people as crazy. And I think we have to be bold. I think we can be amazed. And I've seen this in so many people. I was at a men's conference in Florida this last year, and this one gentleman got up, and he's a business owner, and he gave this incredible testimony about how his life was on the rocks, and he was into drugs and all these different things, and what a mess he was, and then how Jesus Christ changed his life. And he had somebody that challenged him about religion, about Jesus, and he received that challenge. And it would have been easy for someone to say, here's a guy who's, very successful in the world and driven, and he's got everything, and he's not going to want to hear about the gospel, but he needed the gospel. He needed that gospel proclamation, and he received it, and it radically changed his life. And now he's a fool for Christ's sake. He's getting up in front of thousands of men saying, look, without Jesus Christ, you're nothing. The devil's going to own you. You're not going to be what you can be. And he has, in a sense, become a spectacle, as Paul would say, boldly. But I think sometimes we're too careful. We're too cautious. And we don't trust that God's grace can move someone's heart. And we don't trust and believe that every heart is made for God. And so whether the culture doesn't like religion or not, doesn't mean the culture isn't made for religion, isn't made for God, and doesn't need God. And so we've got to be able to have that boldness of St. Paul, I think, to challenge people and to put it out there.
Yeah, and I think there's a funny way that the boldness that you're talking about in terms of giving witness and claiming Christ as our Lord and living in a way that accords with that claim, that boldness in some ways I feel like the apologetic route, the natural law route, which again is fantastic. I teach this, I love this, it's important.
We teach it at the Augustine Institute. We love it. We're not against it.
We are not down on it. But it has a limited place, and we can almost belie our boldness when we try to rely on that too much and not on the proclamation of the crucified Lord. So that when Pope Paul VI has a beautiful phrase where he says, the modern world listens more readily to witnesses than teachers. And if to teachers, because they are also witnesses. And so the teaching of natural law, apologetics, the arguments against abortion and for marriage as we know it ought to be, these have their place, but they are situated in a much bigger context, which is the context of the gospel, the folly of the gospel that transcends our reason, even though we can and ought to, in the right moments, make these reasoned arguments, as Paul does.
And my hope is, and we teach these things because they're very important, and we teach them to our students here at the Augustine Institute. And my hope is that as our students learn the natural law, as they learn these practical reasonings that underpin marriage and all of the Catholic moral teaching, and they understand that gives them a confidence to therefore be bold and proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and to proclaim the cross. I mean, why does the Church teach what it teaches about contraception? Well, if you understand the natural law and if you understand the marital act and the meaning and purpose of it, well, now you can make the proclamation of what the Church teaches with a boldness because you have that underpinning. But you don't always begin your dialogue with the world with a reasoned, rational, natural law. I think we have to also proclaim the faith in Jesus Christ. God calls us to this, and it's good, and here's why. But the why should be able to follow, but we have to express the what God calls us to, and then give the why. But I think we want to get into we get backstage to all the why that we never get to the what.
Right. I mean, in the background here, and in a way at the foreground, is love ultimately. Why do we share these truths? It's because we've fallen in love with Jesus Christ. And to fall in love with the Redeemer means that we're also in love with the Creator. And so to talk about natural law and the natural world and the nature of the human person, we explore these things because we love the Creator and we love His works. But we love the Redeemer as well. And so to see how God elevates that and ennobles that through His grace, that's the other part of our task in what we do. And so to see that harmony there between the reasoned argument and the folly of faith, there's a place for each of these, and there's a very delicate balance, because we wouldn't want to sort of just say, well, there's no place for reason, and all I need to do is sort of, just say the name Jesus, and that'll bring people home. And there's a place for that, leaning in that direction. But the other extreme is what we've been talking about avoiding too, where it's just reasoned argument, and we're afraid maybe to make the proclamation of Jesus Christ.